President of Lippork Group. I apologize. We've had some technical difficulties. Our much respected friend from Switzerland it's 1 o'clock in the morning for him. So rather than have any preamble, I'm just going to jump straight into it and bring him on. Raphael, thanks for
Hi.
being awake in the middle of the night here. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. It's a
Uh,
pleasure to be here.
we want to start with and trying to be respectful of the clock in the middle of the night for you. Want to start with some of your background, your personal background. How did you get into this space stuff in the first place? Why did you get into kind of the space money side of the business? Um, tell us about your background. How'd you get here?
Well, it's basically what you call the money side. The money side is my business. It's always been. I started in investment banking, then I switched over to uh, what we call prop desks, proprietary trading desks, and hedge funds. So I am from the money side. I've
Okay.
added the space side, and the space side kind of came by accident almost. It's I basically got a
And
chance to do some work on
you
space.
got your money chops in Zurich, in the financial field in Switzerland, yes?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
In
Okay.
start in New York, and then places like London and Tokyo.
Okay.
But in any event, I had a chance to do some work on SpaceX about 6, 7 years ago, and I hadn't looked at the space sector before because
Okay.
I thought, well, it's very sort of interesting field from an emotional point of view, let's say. Because who doesn't like space exploration? I hadn't thought about it from very much from the business side. And but I had a chance to do this work on SpaceX, and I realized that we were nearing an inflection point in the space sector, in the sense that really the work SpaceX was and continues to do is driving down costs for the access of space so much that uh, really had a potential to change everything, and that hadn't
Right.
been clear to me. That became clear to me, and then I thought, well, that's interesting. And I started doing more and more work, and then I realized that the launch costs weren't the only thing coming down. Pretty much everything else was coming down in cost as well. And then I was like, well, and not by small amounts, by some cases by orders of magnitude.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah. Yeah.
realized, well, I was a generalist investor, investing in many different industries, and I have never seen an industry where costs go down orders of magnitude and it doesn't have a dramatic effect. And then combine that with
Right.
the fact that space was just, from a personal point of view, much more interesting than anything else I was doing. I said, well, life's short. I should basically switch everything what I'm doing to the space sector.
Wow. Wow. Are you able to talk about what you did for SpaceX, or is that proprietary? It's been
That's more or
years.
less proprietary.
Okay. Okay. All right. Cool. Um, so this is really kind of a relatively recent shift in your life, and it was driven by the numbers and having your eyes opened by this kind of new industry to you, new to you industry. Um, why why kind of change your whole life for it? Like, what was the thing that says, okay, this is the reason to shift the path that I'm on?
Well, again, I think it's a couple. It's basically a combination of two things. One, this is just it's a nice place to be, the space sector, in the sense that it's an interesting topic. It's an emotional in a positive sense topic. Sort of like who doesn't like the excitement of a rocket launch
Right.
or the excitement of somebody flying to the moon or something like that. And then secondly, I thought the economic opportunity could be, well, the long-term economic opportunity could be enormous. And again, this type of, these kind of macro trends that I developed a thesis on, these dramatic cost decreases, these are not things that happen all of the time in many industries. I mean, it's sort of a cliche comparison by now, but I've used this comparison almost for 5 or 6 years, which is that, we may be at a similar point to where basically the internet was sometime in the mid 90s, that you
Right.
have really dramatic trends in place, but they're only just starting, and they will take some time to really work their way through the system and work their way through the economy. And some people don't realize that. Some people think like, well, there has been so much excitement about space, and then we had a SPAC bubble, and that sort of burst, and like deservedly burst. And are we really this early on? And yeah, we're very early on. I can see this in many different ways, which I can talk about. But so anyway, so first, emotional factor. Second, giant economic opportunity. And thirdly, and maybe most importantly, is I do believe that space technology can help to solve many of humanity's big challenges, and from food security or climate to health security, many other things. And again, that's not something that's, I think, clear to many people yet.
We hear the phrase sometimes, going to space to make living on Earth better. And I think that's, I think to me that encapsulates why we're doing this, right? That there's only a small fraction, a sliver of humanity that's going to go to space right now. Maybe in the future, more people, I hope. But the real world implications of the technology development, of the technology transfer, this diffusion, this ubiquitous diffusion of technology throughout the whole global economy, I think that's pretty important. It doesn't get talked about enough. So is that one of the things that you would count as part of your thesis when you make investments? And let's talk about the fund a little bit.
Yeah, sure. No, that's absolutely part of the thesis. Again, that space technology can help probably almost any sector I can think of. And so I think it's going to become as ubiquitous as other, big technologies like artificial intelligence or something like that. But again, this process is just at the very beginning. If you go to your average, even significant size non-aerospace company and talk to them about space, they'll probably most of them will still look at you like, why are you here? Why are you talking to me? Like, what can I do with space? I mean, it's slowly changing, but this is going to take a few years, and that's normal. I'm old enough to remember the internet, and sort of course, by definition, pretty much every company right now uses the internet in some way, but that wasn't the case in 1995, right?
No.
It took a few years for this to disseminate. I could take a more recent example, right? I started dabbling in, so I went back mid-career to get a master's degree in artificial intelligence. And so I went back to university in 2013, and the majority of people asked me like, and I was coming off a hedge fund, right? Majority of people asked me like, why are you going back to school? Like, why are you studying artificial intelligence? This seems completely like obscure and like niche. And I'm like, well, I think it's going to be very important.
Right.
And we're 10 years later, and here's ChatGPT.
Everywhere. It's everywhere.
Here we are.
Yeah.
So I think the same thing is going to happen with space. It's going to take a few years. I know we're early. It's good to be early. Sometimes it's bad to be too early, but I think we're hopefully just around the right time. And this is a thesis. I do think that one of the right ways to participate in all of this is by having an early stage investment fund. Again, I use the internet example. If you had a time machine and you could go back to the mid 90s and kind of decide what you want to do around this internet thing, I mean, short of using real like 2020 hindsight and say, yeah, okay, I'll be Jeff Bezos, the founding Amazon. I mean, that's kind of stupid, right? But you'd say like, okay, I'd start an early stage investment fund, and I hope to catch something like an Amazon or a Facebook or something like that, and that's going to be good enough. So this is sort of the rationale for the fund. This is something we started as a project about 3 years ago, a little bit over 3 years ago.
3 years?
And we're now technically on our second fund.
3 or 4 is 3. It's 3 years. I thought it was a little older than that. Okay.
No, the actual fund structures are started about 3 years ago.
And can you talk about the structure? How many limited partners you have? How big the fund is? What your typical investment looks like?
Yeah, so the funds are basically the investment mandate is it's space only, at least in the current fund. But really anything that is legitimately space related, we can look at. So we can look at all of the traditional stuff that people will know, like satellite communications and Earth observation, GNSS and launchers and satellite integrators. And we can absolutely also look at some of the, let's call them more recent or more recently evolving businesses like space tourism or space manufacturing or other what we call OSM businesses. We could theoretically also look at stuff like lunar business models, and we look at them all of the time. We haven't made any investments yet. So we can look at everything that's legitimately a space-related company. What we won't do is something that is, just using space somewhere tangentially, right? So we're not going to invest in a ridiculous example, but this is something like a real example that other venture capitalists once told me. Like, we won't invest in like a food delivery company because they use GPS to deliver the food.
Right,
It
right,
has to be something
right.
legitimately space
It's got to
related.
be core.
So this is yeah, it's got the majority of the revenues have to basically be enabled by space in a way. And I could kind of go into more detail what that actually means. And then we invest stage-wise. In the current fund, we invest very early, so we go in seed or pre-seed. And then geographically, we are technically global. Practically, this means there's still a lot in the US because by many metrics, that's probably about 2/3 of the global space market. There's an increasing amount in Europe for sure. There's some stuff in other places. So we got investments in Israel. We just made one in India. We could look at other places like, for example, we are constantly looking, but we haven't made investments yet in places like Japan or Australia or Singapore or Latin America. It's easier to talk about the places we don't look at, so we basically don't look at anything that's countries which are strategic competitors of the US.
Sure, right. What kinds? How many investments do you have? How many companies are in your portfolio?
Okay, we have several vehicles, so in total, I think we're now at 16 off the top of my head.
Okay. And then what is your typical, you said seed and pre-seed sizes. So what size investments are pretty typical for you?
So we typically write checks of like, a few $100,000 up to $1 million.
Okay, up to $1 million. Okay. Uh, okay, so there's 16 companies in your portfolio, a couple 100,000 up to $1 million invested. What's your time horizon? You talked about this as the early days of the internet. The internet's had 30 years to evolve. Most funds have a 10-year, maybe a 12-year extension. What do you hope to have happen if you started 3 years ago? What do you hope to happen 7 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, so and you're right. So our fund has a 10-year life, with some extension options, which I do believe is the correct lifetime for a deep tech fund.
Yep.
Also, other types of deep tech other than space. I think it's 10 years is the correct time. Also, you can't really go much beyond that. I mean, the market won't take that. And I think there's a couple of people who have 15-year funds. But 10 years would be sort of normal fund lifetime. Of course, we're hoping for some sort of exit of our portfolio companies, and the traditional exit routes. That could be an IPO, obviously not right now in the current markets. Even though, interestingly, as people may know, there will be an IPO attempt, small IPO of a space company in Japan, iSpace.
iSpace just announced. Yeah.
But markets are the markets. That's what I've been doing all of my life. The markets, the bull markets, the bear markets. The markets come back at some point in time, and there's going to be an IPO window again. Spec window probably will take another few years to come back because lots of people lost lots of money, of course, on that. So IPO, one exit route, acquisitions, of course, and this is probably something we will see more of in the near term. Consolidation.
Yeah.
Much required consolidation, and we're already starting to see that. What's a recent example? Vast space station company acquiring launcher propulsion company, and I think we will see more and more of that. And the acquisitions will come from many different directions. I mean, some of it will be big existing aerospace companies buying additional products capabilities, or even people. It could just be acqui-hires. It could be newer companies, like Vast is not a traditional aerospace company. It's actually a relatively new company, but still they're buying somebody they think fits well with them. And it could be this, we haven't seen that much yet, but I believe we will see it. It could be actually non-space strategic buyers. So,
I have a hunch
some,
that's where we're going to go, right? Organizations like John Deere that have
or
investments.
Google. I mean, Google has done it actually already in the past, but it could be one of the big sort of tech giants.
Yeah.
It could be giant companies in non-space industries like John Deere, or
Yeah.
acquiring basically once they realize John Deere is, from all I can tell, far down this curve compared relatively to other people. Once these companies start realizing that space capability can actually bring them value,
Sure.
they may engage in M&A. Yeah.
It's kind of a no-brainer for a company like Apple that's sitting on $500 billion of cash to decide, okay, let's make our phones a little bit better by providing comms to everyone, right? That's kind of a no-brainer. I'm a little surprised that hasn't happened, but I do definitely expect that to be one of the things that comes into play soon. I think it's going to be. I think we're in the Wild Wild West stage. I was in the internet. I had a small internet company back in 1995, and just to watch things change and change and change, and how quickly. I think we're absolutely at that same spot. So let me ask you a couple questions about launch, because I know that there are some venture funds that will not invest in launch. Have you exited out? Are you willing to hear launch proposals? Pitches?
We try to always talk to everybody, and I mean, unless we think the company is truly not a serious company. But if we believe the founders are serious, I mean, we obviously we have our utmost respect for the founders. I've been an entrepreneur at some point in time myself, and arguably I'm one again now on the side, which we can talk about. But having those guts to become an entrepreneur, and if you're doing it for the right motivations, it's an incredibly tough journey. So we respect the founders, and we will listen to everybody's story. Now, having said all of that, right, you can have the right motivations, and we will still then respectfully disagree with the founders that maybe the market they chose is very, very tough, tougher than they think. And I think that's where launch, probably in our view, and I hesitate to say probably many other space VCs and generalist tech VCs who engage in spaces views as well, that the launch market has, so on paper there's something like close to 200 launch companies, at least like the last time we did this the statistic. Now, in all fairness, the vast majority of that are PowerPoint companies, right? So you can actually X quite a few of them out. And you're probably left with, I don't know, 2 or 3 dozen or something like that. And then what's going to happen? I think you have to then really start segmenting the market, and you have to start doing work and understanding where can each one of these companies really credibly get demand from. And so you'll have one end of the market. You'll have, of course, SpaceX, right? And I will tell you, in terms of like soaking up market demand, and this is SpaceX even in its current configuration, right? Even before we talk about Starship, which of course is going to be a complete step change in capacity and capability. But even right now, then, I mean, because where's demand coming from? Right? Demand's from the governments, and then there's demand from commercial operators, including startups, right? I can certainly say from what I see in our portfolio and companies that we know well adjacent to our portfolio, that most of the commercial companies seem perfectly happy to ride on SpaceX or take the SpaceX, including the SpaceX ride share, right? So I'm sort of always a little bit cautious with all of these arguments that typically fly around from the small launch operators. Were like, oh, but we're so much better than rideshare because you go when you need it to where you need it. And fine, but then I think you have to dig a little bit deeper, and we won't have the time. We could spend an entire one of these episodes just on this, right? But I mean, then I think you really have to. That's a nice argument to make, but I think it deserves deeper analysis. It's like, okay, well, how many people really need this type of really responsive launch? because all of the companies, not all of, but most of the companies I know seem perfectly happy to fly on SpaceX rideshare. And when I talk to them, they're not complaining like, oh, I wish there was something else where I didn't need to use rideshare. I can see the use case, some auto-responsive launch. I mean, certainly for government, certain really important replacement of strategically important satellites or something like that, right? But I'm cautious with that argument for the small launches. Then I do believe, sort of on the positive argument side for the smaller launches, that because of everything else that's going on in the world, governments worldwide have clearly woken up to the fact that space is strategic. And so I mean, everybody has seen in Ukraine how important the communications, the satellite communications capability is, right? Starlink helping to maintain communications, and also how important GNSS is and how important remote sensing is. So governments rightfully saying like, well, it seems like we should have our own capability, like we should have our own SATCOM, GNSS, and remote sensing capability. And for GNSS, this has been happening for a while, that you have various national, regional GNSS constellations. But it's now also happening with SATCOM, right? You may have seen the European Union wants its own secure communications network. They don't want to be caught being reliant on Starlink or somebody else. And it's also happening in remote sensing, where we've seen a number of sovereign countries starting to order basically imaging satellites, and more so than in the past. Then all of that, if you think that's a strategic, it's not enough to build your constellations if you then still rely on some other country's launcher, right? So I think there is an argument that we will see a number of what I'd call sovereign launchers, right? Tied to certain countries or certain regions. And this may well be a reason why some companies then can survive, because they will have this government demand.
Local adoption.
And, I can see certain companies, like so maybe a couple of companies in Europe, a company in Australia, and certain other places on the launch side. Now, and then, sorry, I'm talking a lot, but just kind of coming all the way back. So are we looking at launch or not? So like, yes, we're constantly talking to people. Maybe we'll find somebody where we're comfortable investing. But what I just described basically leaves us with, well, okay, you will invest in SpaceX for the launch side, but SpaceX is not a pure launch company anymore. It is now arguably mostly a SATCOM company. You can, or then you can invest, for the arguments I just made, maybe in some of the regional launches that you think are going to be the sovereign launches in some region. That, however, in my mind, requires then a really solid understanding of the politics,
the local,
whatever region you're talking about. That's not our strength. Like, we understand space technology, we're not political lobbyists, so this is a difficult one for us.
That's a useful distinction. That's a useful insight.
And sorry, I shouldn't say this strongly. So to some extent, we do understand the politics, because you can't do space without understanding some of the politics. But really, like, understanding, I don't know, certain European countries' politics to that depth to judge them, and when basically a space company success maybe almost entirely dependent on this political assessment is a difficult one. And the last thing I would say about this is, which is also another reason why we wouldn't do this sort of like bet on a sovereign launcher, is from our investor base, which is many family offices which share our vision that space is important for humanity, and we should drive the technology stack ahead, and we should work on things that solve some of humanity's big issues. They'd almost be disappointed if we make money just because for political reasons.
Okay, I love that. I don't know if you noticed, there's a lot of activity in the chat. You've got Michael Mealing, co-founder of Starbridge. I think you know him already. And then
yeah, of course,
Dr. Doug Plata. So interesting chat. I'm not going to try and read all that. There's a lot of stuff going on there, but I want you to maybe weigh in on some of the topics they're talking about. What do you think about tourism, space tourism, as a field, as a market, as a phrase, as providing an early marker for point-to-point suborbital. What are your thoughts there? And I just want to respect, we've got about 20 minutes or so. And thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, sure. I can try to keep my answers a little bit short. Space tourism, I love space tourism, and some people might criticize me now. Oh, why do I love the billionaire joyrides? But I think it's important in many ways. And first of all, I think not all of this I would really characterize as tourism, right? There's some parts which, yeah, probably correctly are characterized as tourism if it's a very short ride and people don't really have sufficient time to do anything. But even on the very short rides, frankly, a lot of people try to do at least something. But once you get to something like, speaking about the current space tourism, of course, this is also going to evolve, but if you get something like, the Axiom trips to the ISS, I mean, I think it was today that Axiom released more details on its Axiom 2 mission, right? And those guys are engaging in experiments. They're really trying to sort of select stuff and then and do some hands-on work. And I think you got to respect that. I mean, they're trying to help out. They're trying to be, private space explorers in a way, not pure tourists.
Right.
Having said all of that, even if they were just pure tourists, the money they spend, this is still, the money they spend is still helpful to the industry. And I forget now, we can go back and look it up, but I think at some point in time, Elon said that Yusaku Maezawa, right, the Japanese billionaire who booked the circumlunar flight, the Apollo 8 type mission, I think Elon literally said that that money he paid was not an immaterial contribution to Starship
Right.
R&D.
Right.
And the number is not known, but we can sort of triangulate that it's somewhere, probably about $500 million or so, something in that range. So it's serious money, and yes, of course, it helps for the R&D type stuff. And then I also think that the tourism stuff, it brings, in my mind, anything that brings awareness to our industry is helpful. I mean, of course, it should be done in the right way, and I do think that people like the AX1 and AX2 and AX1, I also had the pleasure to kind of follow in some more detail, and I went to a reception for the AX1 crew in Israel a few weeks ago, and it's basically like almost a half-day conference just on the scientific results of the mission. So that kind of tourism, I think, is quote unquote tourism. I would really rather call it private space exploration. It's great.
I like that.
And it's one of the few businesses where it's proven you can make revenue right now.
Right. I was pretty vocally against tourism as a concept in the earliest days, back in when I started this 2001, 2003, 2005. I was watching. I was on the airfield when the original launch of the X Prize was won. So I had a lot of doubts, a lot of concerns way back when, 15-ish years, 20-ish years ago. And I'm not going to sit here and say I told you so, but I definitely thought that it was a more challenging environment than people were taking. I think they were taking it for granted. It is interesting to me that Virgin is really struggling today. Do you have any thoughts on Virgin? What happens next? What are your predictions? If you had money there, are you happy about it or angry about it? Where are you on Virgin?
Which one? I guess they're probably both struggling, but the Galactic or
Well, I guess I'm kind of thinking about some of the stuff that Branson and team did for the early SPAC. I was pretty surprised. I was kind of against the launching the SPAC, when they did it, how they did it. It launched a whole industry of space SPACs, but I don't know that was good for the industry, and I said so a couple times publicly. But you think the space SPACs are gonna come back? You think that there's gonna be a resurgence for them later? You said all markets come back, so I want to clarify that.
So I mean, sort of the Wall Street guy in me, and everybody can go back and sort of actually read up on that history. SPACs are not a new thing. I
Yeah,
mean,
no,
they kind of come and go, and it's not just space, right?
yeah,
So we're aware of this now because we're in this industry, and this is the first time there has been a wave of space specs, right? But this was in parallel with like God knows how many other like tech specs were going on.
Back in
There,
1996, people asked me to do a reverse merger back when it wasn't called a SPAC, it was called a reverse merger. It was the same mechanics exactly.
yeah, that's, I mean, if it's a true reverse merger, then it's, well, let's not get into the details of that. Otherwise, the investment banker is going to come out in me, and we should talk more about space. But the actual SPACs, yeah, and I mean, there's seems to be like a wave roughly around every 10 years. I don't know why. So it'll probably come back again at some time. And frankly, we do have a very ancient, relatively ancient space back. I mean, people are Iridium,
Yeah.
Iridium and public virus back as well. But long before the more recent SPAC wave. So, so these things come and go. It's very tough when they happen. If you're one of those companies, right? If you're a CEO, if you're on the board of one of those companies at that time, and you may think that what is happening, the fact that you can raise hundreds of millions of dollars in a half-day roadshow, basically, well, that's the spec sponsors, right? And then the merging is even quicker to some extent. It's ridiculous, but you're in a tough position, right? Because even if you think this is unhealthy, it may have disadvantages in the end. Like, what if you at the time don't do it, but your competitor does, and suddenly has like 200 million more of you, right? And there was a few months, there was a period of a few months when that really was sort of the case, where I think everybody had to go through that thought process with their board. It's like, well, this seems sort of strange and weird, and it's probably wrong, but what if we don't do this and our competitor does, right? And so this is why I think, like, one reason all of these deals then happened very quickly. The obvious candidates got picked off, and then the window closed very quickly again. I mean, the window was the real window was roughly open between like summer of, what was that, 2020 and March, April 2021,
Yeah.
something like that.
Sure.
I mean, what is a little bit disappointing is that then those companies, but some of the companies, if they timed it exactly right, did take in not insignificant amounts of money, right? And I think now to basically fail because you're running out of money is a bit shameful.
It's pretty surprising. I mean, I like Redwire. I mean, I'm going to say it. I like the people there. All of my friends that were there in leadership positions have recently left, so it's a different organization than it was when it started. But you know, the acquisition strategy I thought was pretty smart. Acquiring businesses that make money, I thought that was pretty smart. So I don't think that, and this is me as an outsider, right? I know the space field, but not the investment field the way you do. But I thought that there were some smart things that were done in some of the cases. I'm glad that I wasn't putting money into SPACs during those days, right? With those really high valuations. Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's go back to your investment thesis. What would you? And we only have about 10 minutes left. Describe the perfect company for your fund. What like, who are you looking for in terms of people, the technology? Of course, you're going to get pitches after this, but tell us about the perfect. If you were to kind of make a perfect pitch, who is that? What's missing in your portfolio that you want?
So one big sort of thesis we have going on at the moment is what I always describe as a move from infrastructure towards applications. And this is, again, I can draw parallels to the internet. What I mean by that is basically that so far, the space industry, and frankly, probably most of the space investment, particularly by dollars, has been focused on the infrastructure side. And I could also put it in terms of upstream, downstream. I just like the infrastructure application because it has direct sort of semantic comparison to the
Yeah.
internet. What I mean by that is infrastructure would be basically things like launchers, satellite constellations, even space stations, right? Everything you need to sort of like operate in go to space and operate in space. I actually tend to think that by now we have a reasonable amount of infrastructure. I mean, of course, there are gaps, right? So it's like, oh, where's our lunar infrastructure? But okay, I get that, right? But sort of like for Earth orbits, we have, I think, a reasonable amount of infrastructure either already in place or it's coming online over the next few years and is already like financed. So I'm relatively comfortable that there is quite a lot of usable infrastructure up there, right? Which then means, especially as a very early stage venture capitalist, which by definition has to look a few years out, my attention is now shifting to like away from the infrastructure, not completely, not 100%, right? We're still looking at infrastructure, but probably the majority of my attention is now shifting away to thinking about, well, what kind of useful revenue generating applications can we actually run on top of this infrastructure,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And whether that's infrastructure is, certain satellite constellation. And so I give you a couple of examples of what that means actually on the application side. So the really obvious example, which everybody knows, is of course basically downstream with observation companies, right? So the infrastructure exists. You have like God knows how many sensor suites up there already. There are more being put up, including by some already well-financed companies. So high chance it's going to happen. And probably very, very few gaps at this point in time. There still are some, and we're looking at them on the infrastructure side, but a lot of infrastructure is up there, right? So you can use and access to satellites. So now the question for us is, what kind of downstream EO applications can there be, which are really useful, probably to some specific target sector on Earth, whether that's oil and gas or mining or whatever. And can we find good companies, basically building those applications? Now the current issue is that we're getting those business plans. However, almost 100% are not perfect in the sense that those types of business plans, where you're building an application for a specific target market on Earth, basically require interdisciplinary knowledge by definition, right? You need to know the space side. Let's take the downstream EO company. So you need somebody ideally who understands, well, not ideally, you need somebody who understands like, okay, what kind of space data is up there? Like what kind of sensors are up there? What kind of data? Like how do we get the data, right? But then you also, let's say then you want to serve the mining sector. Well, you should have a person who actually knows the mining
Right.
sector. It's like what is useful for the mining sector? How does that fit into the existing work stream? How does it even like mundane stuff? How does it even fit into the existing IT systems? And on the second part is basically we are almost 100% of the pitches we receive fail. I mean, there's some exceptions, but the typical scenario, and again, this is actually one of the things that tells me how early on we are, is that the founding team is basically a couple of Aero Astro guys who met at graduate school, right? And they want to serve the mining sector, but
They
have not
they
enough
they
mining
all
sector.
they were all
And
interns at Blue or SpaceX, right? They have that. They have the chops to fly something.
yeah, and that's great. And
So,
but in fairness, the sort of the people who coming out of those companies, I think they tend to know their capabilities and they're very good on the infrastructure side. So you get some really exciting companies. I mean, you talk about that. You get some really exciting companies who come out of SpaceX and Blue. I mean, just Blue, right? Relativity, Stoke, fantastic company. Some others which I think are not public, which are still stealth, but yeah, but they tend to be on the infrastructure side. But on vacation side, we have this issue, lack of interdisciplinary teams. But it also tells me how early on we are. And frankly, I'm old enough to remember this for the internet. The first internet companies, basically the founders were computer science people like Mark Andreessen.
yeah.
And then it took a while to get other people in. This is actually one big reason why I'm doing outreach, because we need to attract these other people, the non-space people, to the space sector to build this type of company. But so yeah, downstream always one applications example. Another example that we're really excited about is in-space manufacturing
I love
for
that.
material science and biotech purposes on Earth. I mean, in fact, and then we're actually facing the same issue again, which is that ideally, well, not ideally, I think it does require an interdisciplinary team. Let's say you want to do something with like, biotech manufacturing in space. I mean, God forbid, but we're actually seeing this. You're like aerospace engineers trying to do this. It's like they have no business trying to do
Right.
that. This has to be biotech people who then use a platform that's operated by aerospace engineers. Fine, but that's the right way to do it. But again, we're seeing a total lack of interdisciplinary teams. But this is something we're so excited about, and there's a lack of team. We basically just recently co-founded a company ourselves in space biotech. We just put the right team together. Um, and yeah, so that's another example of an application that we're really excited
So in
about.
our last 4 minutes, let's talk about that recent investment, because that's not normal. That's not usual for a VC company. They might have an entrepreneur in residence program, but they'll build the company outside. Is that what you did?
Yeah, so how this happened in practice is so we co-funded the company outside of the fund, and it's now going through the process where the fund is evaluating and it's going to invest in it. I mean, this is something which, I mean, there's a whole model which is called venture
Yeah.
studios, which is basically this, right? You sort of like take an idea and run with it and like put the company together. We're not originally set up as a venture studio, but because of these dynamics of where the space sector is right now, me and my partners, the two partners, we've always said from the very beginning, we might very well end up in situations where we think there is a very significant opportunity. The sector is so early on, there is no team doing it yet. So we're willing to kind of engage in venture studio type activity on a very limited basis. The sort of like very simplistic way we decided is with three partners. We said, well, this is a certain time commitment if this happens, because then probably means that one of the partners is very heavily involved. So we said we're going to do one max per partner.
Okay.
So it would be three for the entire fund. We're like one down so far.
Well, fingers crossed. That's certainly very exciting. What is that new business going to do? What hole are they trying to fill?
So this new business, we believe, has the best technology in the world to grow human three-dimensional human tissue and microgravity.
Wow.
Because of the microgravity that allows you to grow the human tissue very cleanly in 3 dimensions without scaffolding or matrices, which has certain advantages. And we're basically licensed technology from a big university that is proven because the academic team has flown this 2 times to the ISS already and has produced various different tissue types extremely successfully. So it's kind of a little bit different in the sense that the technology is largely de-risked, and we're going to keep improving it, but the basic technology is largely de-risked and is now about commercializing it. And this has basically two big, well, sort of, I should say, three big use cases. One is just general life sciences research. Second is preclinical drug testing process as an alternative to animal
Yeah.
models, which is something that has recently received significant regulatory tailwind in the US, as something called the FDA Modernization Act was passed by Congress and then signed into law by President Biden, which basically motivates and allows pharma companies to switch away from animal models like mice or zebrafish or monkeys and whatever. And then the third use is very exciting, is in regenerative medicine. So we could grow these tissues and they could then be used really to, you could grow cartilage and replace like worn out cartilage in your knee. And then of course the sort of dream a few years down the road is to replace parts or even entire organs. That's going to take a little while for
Yeah.
sure, but that will happen. And I think we're now at the forefront of that. So we're very excited with this company because all of those markets I talked about right now, those are pharma business on Earth, the pharma sector. That's a big sector with a lot of money.
Yeah.
So those are real target markets.
Yeah, that's definitely got the attention of our in the audience. Doug is a medical doctor. He's an emergency room doctor, so he's asking questions about 3D tissue printing. Can it be solved on Earth? Um, uh, we do have to wrap up. I want to be really respectful of your time. It's 2 o'clock in the morning for you in Zurich, so I want to just kind of wrap up and say thank you. Super quick because we almost missed it. You mentioned your outreach efforts. Talk about your podcast a minute, and I'm going to post the link to the show in the chat here.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The original idea for the podcast is very creatively named the Space Business Podcast, even though it's not only about business anymore, is basically what I mentioned before, that I think it's hugely important to educate more people about the space sector, people who haven't drunk the Kool-Aid yet. I mean, and we all have, right? But as I said, we need like a lot more, workforce, investors, and just general supporters in the space sector if we really want to grow to these trillions of dollars of market size that people are hoping for. And this is originally why I started doing this. Is like, and I know that probably the majority of listeners are still people from the space sector, and that's fine. That I'm trying. Hopefully, it's reaching some people beyond the space sector. That was the original idea as well. We always keep it very non-technical. The typical guest is a space entrepreneur, CEO of some startup, that I interview about the startup. What the startup is, why they're doing it, in detail on the business model, and so forth. Sometimes we have just other interesting people from the larger space family on there. So Chris Hadfield was on there. Professor Avi Loeb from Harvard was on there. Yeah. So every few episodes we get somebody who's not a business person.
Awesome. All right, Raphael, thank you so much. Try to get some sleep.
Sure.
I know you've got a busy day tomorrow, so thanks so much for being a part of this. I appreciate your kind of perseverance through some of the technical issues we had this afternoon. And I'll ping you later this week. I want to follow up on a few things. All right. Thanks a lot, sir. Appreciate it.
Good. Thanks, Michael.
Have a good night.
All the best.
Sleep well.
Take care.
Bye-bye.